It's nice to see a lively crowd this morning, given that it has been rather chilly outside the past few days. Thank you to the Columbia Museum of Art for hosting me. I feel like it's been a long time coming, and at the same time, sort of a closing of a circle. In 2010, when Todd Herman was curator, I was able to curate a small show from the permanent collection, and then have been otherwise occupied at the university in the duration. So thank you again for having me. Well, welcome. Today I want to take you on a journey through nearly 2 centuries of American art by focusing on one deceptively simple subject, landscape. The American landscape inspires both faith and fear, hostility and hope. It has been seen as an obstacle to progress or a vision of the future. Still, it leaves a lasting imprint on our imagination. We think of landscape painting, or when we think of landscape painting, we often think of pretty views, such as trees, rivers, and mountains. But Americans have had a varied and conflicting view of the American landscape. Is it wilderness or paradise? At the time of our nation's founding, it was considered a savage world, but also a new Eden. But for American artists, landscape has always been much more than just scenery. It has been a way to talk about national identity, spirituality, expansion, industry, memory, anxiety, and environmental crisis. Landscape artists show the history of American attitudes and visions of America from different eras, which reflect and shape the imagination. Welcome to 2026. The year our country celebrates its 250th anniversary and the signing of the Declaration of Independence. This is a time of celebration and reflection and provides us with the opportunity to explore the art of the United States. To do so, I would like to begin with a series of questions for your consideration as we begin our exploration into some of America's early landscape paintings. What impact did America's independence have on art from 1800 to 1860? How did the War of 1812 and the Louisiana Purchase affect American art? How did the Indian Removal Act of 1830 impact art? How did art from 1800 to 1860 portray the westward movement? Why did American art focus on nature during the 19th century? And finally, how did the Hudson River School way of thought and artistic expression come out in American paintings? Why did artists focus on the land in the West as the subject of their paintings? So we see here that the population density is centered in the Northeast, and we see it begins to grow and move westward. The impact of that Western movement is, of course, all of these different historical events that happened between 1776 and 1912. And while this painting, Buffalo Hunt, in the collection is not currently on view, I want to start with this to kind of contextualize where we were and what the thinking was in the United States in the 1800s. In 1991, the Smithsonian American Art Museum mounted an exhibition and published a catalog called West as America. One of the essay's authors, Julia Schnimmel, wrote an essay called Inventing the Indian, where she posited that European American and European artists, as well as, European American and American artists of the 19th century created imaginary representations of Native people, rather than documenting their interactions with and observances of Native Americans. Part of this was based on the political beliefs of the time, as well as the artist's own perceptions and interpretations of the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Schnimmel suggests 3 ways in which Indians were depicted, and they are the noble savage, the barbarian or brutal warrior and aggressor, and the doomed Indian. We think about the film, The Last of Mohicans. Come on in. The painting Buffalo Hunt illustrates Schimmel's reading as I see it fits in the category of a noble savage or perhaps a brutal warrior. At this time, Native people were treated as, quote unquote, the other. American progress and successful growth westward was based on the American Indians' decline. A quote from President Andrew Jackson around 1836 drives this point home. Quote, "Indian removal will separate the Indians from immediate contact with settlements of whites, free them from the power of the states, enable them to pursue happiness in their own way and under their own rude institutions, will retard the progress of decay, which is lessening their numbers," end quote. As we move on in exploration of the landscape of 19th century paintings, I ask you to be on the lookout for representations of Native Americans and ask yourself, how are they depicted? If they are not included at all, ask yourself why or why not. Now let's begin our exploration of landscapes and also seascapes in this case. In the early 19th century, when the United States was still a young nation and its artists were still trying to figure out what American art should look like. Our first painting is Washington Allston's Coast Scene on the Mediterranean from 1811. Allston was educated in a school in his native Charleston, South Carolina, prepared for college in Newport, and went to Harvard, where he graduated with honors and was the class poet. After leaving college, he sold his share of the family property in order to finance his study abroad. In 1801, he sailed for England, and from 1804 to 1808, he spent time in Italy and mostly in Rome. He made 2 trips to England where he studied with the renowned American history painter Benjamin West, who many of us Americanists claim and European scholars also claim. In 1818, he was elected honorary member of the American Academy of Fine Arts, and in the same year, he returned to the United States to live the rest of his life in Boston, Cambridge, and Cambridgeport. In 1827, his first exhibition was held at the Boston Athenaeum. Allston painted this Mediterranean seascape while he was living in England. This may seem like an odd place to start because it isn't American land at all, but that's the point. Early American artists were trained in European traditions, and Allston brings romantic ideals with him, those ideals of drama, emotion, and a belief that landscape can carry a moral or spiritual meaning. So what is Romanticism? Romanticism refers to the European movement affecting visual arts, literature, and music from the mid-18th to the mid-19th centuries. Viewed as a reaction to neoclassical formality, it stressed emotion and the right to individual expression. Works encompass a range of styles, but in general are painterly, dynamic, and reflect an interest in color. By the mid-19th century, American landscape painting had come into its own with what is often referred to as the Hudson River School. As we move to Thomas Doherty's Autumn Landscape from 1835, something important happens. Artists begin to turn their attention to the American land itself. The American tradition of romantic painting began in the mid-1820s with the work of Thomas Cole, Asher B. Durand, and including Thomas Doherty, who was one of the founders of the Hudson River School. Cole and his followers were influenced by Dutch and British traditions of landscape painting. Cole believed that Americans were given a second chance to live within undisturbed natural paradise, something squandered by the Europeans. Furthermore, he believed it was incumbent upon Americans to embrace nature's grandeur and majesty, to live in harmony with the bounty and the spectacle of the environment. Artists who followed Cole, again known as the Hudson River School of Painters, initially painted subjects on the East Coast in the Catskill and Adirondack Mountains. Later, artists in the second generation ventured beyond the Mississippi to capture the splendor of Yosemite, the Grand Canyon, and the South American Andes. Doherty took a bit of a different path. He taught himself to paint by studying the work of earlier European artists. His travels to Europe were limited by financial constraints. He favored pastoral tranquility over the grandiose romantic scenes that would launch the careers of his more successful colleagues, and we'll see some of those coming up. Whoops, sorry about that. Albert Finch Bellows was another American landscape painter of the Hudson River School. Bellows was born in Midland, Massachusetts. He first studied architecture and in 1849 became the partner of the Boston architect John D. Towle. However, Bellows quickly turned to painting. From 1850 to 1856, he taught at the New England School of Design in Boston. He resigned his post to travel and study abroad and spent time in Paris and at the Royal Academy at Antwerp, as well as in England. So you see a pattern here. He exhibited his first work at the National Academy of Design in 1857, becoming a full member in 1861. Bellows settled in New York City in 1858 on his return to America and spent most of his remaining career in New York City, though briefly he spent time in and out of Boston. Bellows' The Riverbank, also from 1861, softens the grandeur of the landscape, the large-scale landscape paintings, much in the same way that Doherty did. Instead of looking out to the vista to see the land unfold our eyes, as we saw in the previous painting, this painting has more of a central focus on the bank itself. Instead of spectacle, we get intimacy. As we see the person sitting on the bank, this is nature that you can sit in, sit beside, and experience quietly. Thomas Worthington Richridge was a highly regarded artist at the time as well, and he was friends with several leading Hudson River School artists, including Alfred Beardstadt and Sanford Robinson Gifford. He traveled widely and excelled at landscape painting. He served as president of the National Academy of Design from 1874 to 1875 and was member of the selection committee for the 1876 Philadelphia Centennial Exposition and the 1878 Paris Exposition, both of which were important venues for artists during this day and time. Whitridge's The Pinecone Gatherers from 1866 introduces human figures not as conquerors, but as participants, just as we saw in the Bellows painting. The message is subtle but important. Americans belong in this land, and the land sustains everyday life. Robert Selden Duncanson was born in 1821 in Fayette, New York. Charles Duncanson, Robert's grandfather, was an emancipated enslaved man from Virginia. He moved north to Fayette in 1790. Charles' son, John Dean, and his wife, Lucy, raised a family of 7 children, including Robert. Duncanson grew up in Monroe, Michigan, where he learned the family trade of house and ornamental painting, as well as carpentry. Working in Monroe from 1838 to 1839 as a painter and glazier, he dreamed of becoming an artist. He left Michigan around 1840 for Cincinnati, Ohio, to pursue a career as an artist. Moving to Cincinnati offered a great number of opportunities for Duncanson. Located on the Ohio River, Cincinnati was on the border of the southeastern United States at the time in American history when abolition of slavery was an important issue. Upon his arrival, Duncanson settled in Mount Healthy, an area northwest of the city known for its abolitionist sympathies and home to a tightly knit group of African Americans. Although he was aware of the struggles he would face as an African American working in a city so close to the South, he soon received several commissions from Cincinnati citizens. Duncanson's early career in Cincinnati was that of an itinerant or self-taught artist. Throughout the 1840s, he traveled between Cincinnati and Detroit, painting portraits, historical paintings, and fancy pictures. As an African American artist, he found it difficult to secure commissions to sustain him, and at times was nearly penniless. His career received a major boost in 1848 when he was commissioned by abolitionist Charles Avery to paint the landscape Cliff Mine, Lake Superior. This association led to lifelong relationships with those who wanted to support Black artists. Also among those interested in Duncan was Nicholas Longworth, the city's greatest art patron. In 1850, Longworth commissioned Duncanson to create a series of 8 murals for his home, Belmont, which is now the Taft Museum of Art. While working on this commission, the young artist gained access to Longworth's art collection and broadened his interest in landscape painting. Longworth was so impressed with Duncanson, referring to him as, quote, one of our most promising painters, end quote, and a man of great industry and worth, end quote. And so Longworth sponsored Duncanson's first Grand Tour trip to Europe. Between April 1853 and June 1854, Duncanson made the Grand Tour, visiting London, Paris, and Florence. He was the first African American to have such an opportunity. After returning to Cincinnati, Duncanson continued to paint landscapes in addition to portraits of local citizens, including Longworth. The Hudson River School painters, as well as Worthington Ritwidge, and William Sontag, with whom he went on painting excursions in the Ohio Valley, influenced his style of landscape painting. With the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861, Duncanson traveled through the northern United States and Canada, hoping to escape the turmoil of the fighting and anti-African fervor. In the summer of 1865, Duncanson returned to Europe and traveled to Scotland, where he earned international acclaim from the British press. So let's talk a little bit about this painting. In this painting, we see a calm, reflective river that runs across the foreground, middle ground, with rounded boulders closest to the viewer. Beyond the water, lush trees and a softly lit mountain rise under a pastel sky with delicate clouds. The overall effect is quiet, luminous, and pastoral. It's more about atmosphere and mood than dramatic action. The river and the sky are used to spread light across the whole composition, and there is a layered depth, as we see, as I mentioned, the foreground has the rocks, the mid-river sheen is in the middle ground, and in the distant view, we see the mountains. This is a trope that's used to direct your eye to look at different areas of the painting. So it kind of walks you through the foreground, middle ground, and background. As we see, Duncanson is closely associated with the romantic American landscape painting Hudson River School artists. Duncan's landscape painting practice involves his working in pastoral and picturesque modes that aimed to elevate landscape by conveying big ideas and moral lessons, using North American vistas as metaphors for cultural identity. Consequently, Silver River, North Carolina, reads like an idealized, meditative nature image rather than a representation of the bustling industrial South. So why does this work matter? It matters because it was painted in 1863, where it sits inside the Civil War. And Duncan's career is often associated in relation to how he navigated and sometimes stepped away from wartime America. Even if you approach Silver River purely as a landscape, the timing makes this painting's stillness and order feel pointed. It offers a vision of stability and harmony at a moment when the nation was violently fractured. There's an ongoing debate, which is why I'm spending so much time on this painting, in Duncan's scholarship about how explicitly or subtly his landscapes encode racial and political meaning. Some argue that while within mainstream romantic landscape idioms, he could subtly express a distinctive viewpoint shaped by being a Black artist in pre-Civil War America. So one way to read this painting is as a straight landscape, as we've been talking about. We could also think of it as a carefully constructed vision of peace, freedom, and belonging articulated through nature, which was especially resonant given it was 1863. Thomas Moran's Shepherdess Watching Her Flock from 1867 blends American ambition with European pastoral tradition. Even as the country was industrializing, artists continued to imagine nature as an ideal refuge. In Shepherdess Watching Her Flock, painted during one of his visits to Europe, Moran captures a moment of peaceful rural life, likely inspired by his time in the French or Spanish countryside. The painting reflects Moran's ability to blend the sweeping grandeur of landscapes with intimate human-scale subjects. The shepherdess, positioned in the foreground, gazes thoughtfully over her flock, embodying the solitude of rural existence. However, Moran was more and mostly recognized as being a member of the second generation of the Hudson River School, and for his idealized views of the American West. And while we don't want to diminish the contributions of the work we just saw that's here in the Columbia Museum of Art, I wanted to bring this in as sort of a comparison, because this is more on par with what he was known for in his work. In 1871, Moran accompanied a government surveying expedition to Yellowstone and was greatly inspired by the landscape. He was one of the first to document the unique wonders of Yellowstone. The mountain man Jim Bridger had first told of this magical place, but nobody believed him when he spoke of the unusual features like geysers, hot pools, and strange rocks. Moran conveyed the sense of nature's vastness in his watercolors, and above all in his huge 1872 painting, The Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, which was the first painting ever purchased by the federal government. So here you're seeing 84 inches by 104 inches. It is all-encompassing. You can hardly see beyond the edges of it. The peripheral view is blocked because it's so vast and so large. Moran's spectacular vision promotes both the grandeur of wilderness and the nation it belongs to. An explorer, an Indian guide, peer into the gorge, and the artist himself is seen in the shadows and is dwarfed by the scale of his own picture. On the rocky right, we see spires that rise up like cathedrals. A contemporary of Moran and the second generation of the Hudson River School is Albert Bierstadt. Bierstadt was born in Germany, and he was only 2 years old when his family moved from Germany to New Bedford, Massachusetts. So again, we claim him as an American artist. In 1853, he returned to Germany to study in Dusseldorf, where he refined his technical abilities by painting alpine landscapes. After he returned to America in 1857, he joined an overland survey expedition, which allowed him to travel westward across the country. So this is the example that we have in the Columbia Museum of Art. Again, a more serene pastoral setting, kind of communing with nature, if you will. And fast forward to his dramatic The Domes of Yosemite. Again, another very large-scale, all-encompassing painting. You see here the dramatic light, the vast scale. It really communicates and conveys a sense of awe. These paintings present nature as sublime, it's overwhelming, it's majestic, and it's often interpreted as divinely created. In this way, landscape becomes a moral and even religious experience. Moran and Bierstadt's paintings exemplified the idea of manifest destiny, which was the belief that God had ordained settlement of the entire continent for the American race. However, westward expansion and settlement threatened the pristine wilderness, and Americans became aware of the conflict between using the land as a resource and as a protected zone. Indeed, if God gave the American nation this new Eden, we were spoiling it pretty fast, and anybody in the 19th century could see this. At least we can now, upon retrospect. There is a sense of nostalgia and a loss in many of the paintings already by 1865. To summarize, during the mid-19th century, the artistic movement focused on nature and landscape of this vast new land that America had recently gained control of from the Louisiana Purchase. The naturalist style helped in portraying the West as an uninhabited expanse of land that was pristine in its beauty and abundant in its opportunity, which ultimately led to a mass movement of people to the West. Near the turn of the 20th century, many artists moved away from detail and toward mood. Here we see Robert Albert Blakelock's Moonlight from 1883. This is an example of tonalism. Tonalism, T-O-N-A-L-I-S-M, is defined by the Getty as a movement of the late 19th and early 20th centuries that are practiced by British and American artists. We often think of Turner, J.M.W. Turner's paintings. The movement defined a painting style similar to Impressionism based on soft, diffuse light, muted tones, and vague, nebulous outlines of objects. The movement diverged from Impressionism and expressed symbolist tendencies in its use of neutral palettes, expressions of contemplative nature, and in its subjective style centered on the establishment of atmosphere or mood. We see here this scene is dark, it's emotional, it's subjective. Blakelock isn't describing a place so much as a feeling. This marks a major shift, landscape as inner experience. Blakelock began his career painting grandiose landscapes in the style of the Hudson River School, but by the 1870s, he changed his style dramatically and reduced the scale of his paintings to a more intimate size. Like the French Impressionists, such as Claude Monet, Blakelock visited the same locations repeatedly to document changes in the light at different times of night. Consequently, there are different versions of moonlight paintings in museums around the United States, from the Brooklyn Museum of Art to the High Museum of Art to our own Columbia Museum of Art. Here we see that he begins experimenting with flattening of the image by blending the water and sky at the horizon line, removing clear perspective of foreground, middle ground, and background. For this technique, Blakelock layers oil paint on the canvas, and then he scrapes it or scores the surface. And in this poor image that I appropriated, we see a bit of a craquelure, which are the tiny cracks on the surface and the varnish due to the age. And this naturally occurs as paintings age if they were finished with a varnish over the oil painting. Another example of tonalism is this work by Charles Warren Eaton, Early Autumn from 1922. Charles Warren Eaton's Early Autumn sits right at the mature, distilled phase of his long career. It's a beautiful example of how quietly radical his landscapes can feel once you slow down and really look. By 1922, Eaton was no longer a young painter influenced by the Hudson River School or the decorative softness of tonalism. He had fully absorbed tonalism and the traditions of the Hudson River School and then pared them down to make them his own. He was in his mid-60s at the time this was painted. He was painting with confidence, restraint, and a very personal sense of atmosphere. His landscapes are spiritualized landscapes rather than topographical ones. This painting is about seasonal transition and emotional quiet, and we'll see this seasonal transition come up again in our conversation today. The painting is likely set in the northeastern United States, but rather than blazing fall color, Eaton focuses on the earliest signs of the season. Trees are just beginning to thin or shift in color. It's a calm, open spatial structure, and the land and sky, as I mentioned, are gently merging rather than competing with one another. The horizon is low, softened, and it encourages viewers to sink into the space. Nothing feels abrupt or overstated. The eyes move slowly and deliberately. In his work, there is typically no human presence, which is important because Eaton wants nature to feel self-contained, meditative, and timeless. In early autumn, the palette is restrained. We see soft browns, olive greens, grays, and muted golds. Again, autumn appears as a tonal shift. Light is diffusive and not directional, suggesting overcast skies or a late afternoon calm. Rather than describing the weather or the time of day explicitly, Eaton lets color temperature and tonal harmony do the work. Again, the effect is contemplative and inward, and it's almost musical. His execution is very smooth and controlled. This work reminds us of a universal feeling. It has a poetic quality. We are meant to think not, where is this? But hopefully it conveys, I know that feeling. I've been there, I've seen that, or I want to go there, right? We're skipping ahead now to something very different. So here we have Charles Wiesen's Manhattan from 1937, and we're getting into more of my area of expertise. So this is an example of modern art or modernism. So what exactly is modern art or modernism? Well, it's difficult to define, according to the Museum of Modern Art, because there is no single answer. Modern art has been defined by critics and scholars as a rejection of older artistic traditions, including institutions such as royal academies, a rejection of genres such as religious painting or historical painting, and techniques such as linear perspective. Often, modern art has been described as a way for artists to explore the very idea of art, how it's made, what it means, and who it's for. Modernism represents a significant shift in the art world, highlighting the importance of individual expression and exploring abstract ideas. Artists distinguish themselves by utilizing non-traditional materials and experimenting with innovative techniques, often challenging established norms. The emergence of modernism coincided with profound societal changes driven by the Industrial Revolution and urbanization in the late 1800s and early 1900s. This era is often marked by emotional intensity, social commentary, and a desire to establish a deeper connection with audiences beyond simple aesthetics. So the key takeaways for modernism. Modernism as in art represents a departure from the traditional conventions. It emphasizes the emotional depth and social commentary, engaging viewers in an active dialogue. It has major movements that begin with Impressionism in France and continue to the late 1960s and early 1970s in the United States, with each challenging artistic norms. It's influenced by industrialization. It explores themes of alienation, technology, and the complexities of life. It fosters diverse artistic practices, encouraging experimentation and addressing social and political issues. And so if you've ever even studied art history or read a label that talked about all of the different isms, this is where the isms come in. There are many different types of modernisms. Here, we see that American landscape is no longer just rural or natural. Charles Wiesen's Manhattan redefines landscape as an urban experience. The city becomes a new kind of terrain. It's vertical, it's crowded, and it's modern. Manhattan is a compact but telling window into American modernism on the eve of World War II and into how artists were grappling with the idea of a modern city as both symbol and lived environment. Bazin was born in France, but raised and trained partly in the US. Early in his career, he was associated closely with American Impressionism and exhibited with artists like Childe Hassam and J. Alden Weir. By the 1910s to the 1930s, we see that his work has evolved dramatically. He's exploring looser brushwork, a stronger structure, and an increased interest in New York. By the time he painted this painting, he was an elderly artist responding to a world that had changed radically from the pastoral and coastal scenes of his youth. And the date of 1937 here is important because the Great Depression is still ongoing, though recovery had begun. Manhattan, by this point, is already a global symbol of financial power, technological ambition, and modern density and speed. We see that skyscrapers really dominate the composition, right? By 1930, the Chrysler Building is built. 1931, the Empire State Building has been built. And so we see artists in the 1930s are oscillating between the awe of modern architecture and the anxiety about urban alienation and industrial scale. We see a flattening of the plane here, and it really is a condensed cityscape, much more so than a literal topographical view of a specific place. It's an idea. It's an idea of verticality, of mass, and rhythm, more than it is a precise location. I brought a couple of other examples for comparison, just to think about what we're seeing. While Bazin's work is from 1937, we see this embrace of New York City as early as the 1910s, as I mentioned. We have here a work by John Marin on the left and Georgia O'Keeffe. Oh, excuse me, these are both by John Marin. We'll look at Georgia O'Keeffe next. And John Marin mostly painted in watercolor. He spent most of his time in Maine and did a lot of seascapes, but he was a part of the modernists who showed early on at 291 Gallery in New York City that was run by Alfred Stieglitz, and he became an important member of the Stieglitz Circle. And we see here, in contrast to the slide before, much more energy. We see a real flattening and a compilation of the buildings, really trying to convey that sense of just the skyscrapers being built one on top of the other. You know, thinking about your perspective as someone walking down the street and how everything is just shadowed now by the tallness of all of the buildings. His contemporary, Georgia O'Keeffe, who is, of course, most known for her southwestern landscapes and her floral pictures, took New York on as a subject for a long period of time as well. She lived in the Sheldon Hotel. The Sheldon Hotel was the tallest building at the time it was built in the 1920s, and she lived on the 30th floor. So we see here her abstracted view on the left, and on the right, the view from her window, showing a more realistic depiction of what it was like to see New York City. So you have, again, these literal interpretations, these abstract interpretations, these very frenetic, moving examples of trying to communicate the urbanization and the technology that is moving so fast during the machine age. Now, I don't believe this work made it on the list for the new reinstallation, but it's an important example to kind of align with this idea of industrialization and sometimes its negative impacts and positive impacts on the United States. We see here Locomotive Shop, New York Central, Albany, by Lawrence Nelson Wilbur from 1946. Wilbur was a mid-20th century American painter, best known for his realistic depictions of industrial, urban, and working environments. This is a classic example of post-war American industrial realism, focusing not on scenic landscape, but on the built environment where labor, technology, and national identity intersect. Painted in 1946, this work sits at a pivotal historical moment. It's the immediate aftermath of World War II, when American industry was transitioning from wartime production to peacetime infrastructure. The painting depicts the interior of a locomotive repair shop or maintenance shop belonging to the New York Central Railroad in Albany, New York, which was one of the most powerful and symbolically important rail systems in the United States. Key elements include massive steam locomotives or their components, a cavernous interior space with structural beams, girders, tracks, and machinery. And the focus is both the narrative action of the welder in the center, that is shining the light while he's doing the work, but also the industrial presence that is communicated by the weight, the scale, and the endurance of the railroad system itself. The color palette is very dim. The natural lighting barely filters in the windows. It creates a strong contrast to what we think of as more traditional pastoral landscape painting. Rather than mountains or rivers, Wilbert presents industry itself as landscape. The locomotive shop becomes a modern equivalent of early American landscape painting. It's a space that defines national identity at this moment in time. The need for human physical labor has replaced the time and space for contemplative reflection in nature, especially given the return of the majority of the male workforce after World War II. America's industrial and technology confidence was at a peak level, so Wilbur really leaned into realism. He leaned into realism at a time when social realism was waning and when the avant-garde style of the day was non-objective abstract expressionism, which was popularized by Jackson Pollock. Moving on to abstraction, we see here Hans Burckhardt's A Rainy Day from 1951, which uses the city to convey emotional tension. Here, the landscape reflects psychological states of mind rather than geography. By 1951, Hans Burckhardt was deeply engaged with the emotional fallout of World War II and the early Cold War. Although he never served in combat, he was profoundly affected by global violence, human suffering, and political injustice. And these are just some of the themes that dominate his work from the 1940s onward. A Rainy Day emerges during the formative years of abstract expressionism, but Burckhardt occupies a slightly different lane, if you will, than the New York painters or the New York School of Painters or Jackson Pollock or, say, a Mark Rothko. While those artists, Rothko, Pollock, often pursued pure abstraction or spiritual transcendence, Burckhardt's abstraction remains anchored to human experience, pain, and moral urgency. He was working in Los Angeles, where abstract expressionism developed a darker, more existential edge. It was less heroic and more anguished. Though abstract, A Rainy Day suggests a recognizable emotional environment rather than a literal landscape. The composition is dense and layered, with heavy downward moving forms that evoke a falling rain. Dark muted tones dominate the canvas, and paint is applied in a vigorous and tactile way with thick strokes and scraped surfaces that give the work physical weight. And I invite you all to go look for that physical weight when you visit the galleries. Forms feel compressed and unstable, as though the painting itself is burdened by gravity. Rather than depicting rain as refreshing or romantic, Burckhardt presents it as oppressive and relentless, reinforcing a sense of emotional suffocation. He uses rain as a metaphor to suggest grief and mourning. The canvas conveys a heaviness and weight of the world's situation as he immerses the viewer in a state of emotional pressure, mirroring the psychological climate of the early 1950s, a time when nuclear anxiety, political repression, and post-war delusionment often dominated. In A Rainy Day, he doesn't show suffering, he makes the viewer feel it. There is no clear narrative, no identifiable figures, and no visual escape. Unlike many of his contemporaries on the East Coast, his abstractions remain expressively representational, and it is explicitly political and ethical, even though it's non-figurative. This is a very different approach than his contemporaries on the East Coast, as I mentioned, Jackson Pollock, Martha Rothko, Lee Krasner, among others, who were considered apolitical. And in their works, they were considered apolitical because they were devoid of meaning. And this, of course, is at a time when we had the Un-American Activities Committee, who are ferreting out former communist artists that worked in the Works Progress Administration. And so you see the abstractionists, the abstract expressionists, really digging into just the movement of the gestures and things, and not trying to be classified as making a political statement for their own personal success as well as their own personal protection. A Rainy Day belongs to a critical middle phase in Burkhart's career when he had fully abandoned traditional figuration. His themes grew darker and more universal, and he began confronting violence indirectly through atmosphere rather than imagery. Let's move on to something a little lighter. This is the work Enchanted Mesa by Martha Hamlin, and I'm not sure how to pronounce her name, I will admit, Wasserhooft. She was an American-born artist who was classically trained, and her mature work deeply reflects her engagement with modernist simplification rather than academic realism. She consistently gravitated toward landscape as psychological and spiritual place, again, moving away from topography. Like many American artists of her generation, she was strongly influenced by the Southwest, particularly New Mexico and Arizona, where landscape became a site of myth, solitude, and transcendence. We see here that she has fully absorbed modernist ideas of flattened space, reduced forms, and expressive color, while remaining firmly representational. The title, Enchanted Mesa, refers to the Mesa Encantada in New Mexico, which is a naturally dramatic sandstone formation long associated with indigenous land, spiritual presence, and mythic abandonment. According to Pueblo tradition, the mesa was once inhabited but became inaccessible after a natural disaster, turning it into a symbol of loss, mystery, and sacred isolation. By the 20th century, it had become a recurring motif in American art and literature, often standing for timelessness, spiritual endurance, and the tension between human history and geological permanence. Wasserhoof's choice of subjects places her in conversation with artists like Georgia O'Keeffe, again, and Marsden Hartley, at a time when, as we've discussed, abstract expressionism dominated the American art scene. As we mentioned, most artists were abandoning representation entirely, but she keeps hers figurative yet modern. This positions her work as a part of a countercurrent, the countercurrent of artists who believed landscape still mattered, not as nationalism or conquest, but as a personal encounter and spiritual reflection. The mesa is central and monumental here. It's rising from a simplified foreground, and it takes up the entire surface of the canvas. Spatial depth is shallow. Bands of color cause the eye to move around the painting, and the yellow provides a hint of perspective as it works to define a horizon line across the center. Unlike earlier American landscapes that framed nature as something to be claimed or mastered, Wasserhooft presents it as unknowable and autonomous. Without the title, viewers would not know that it represents a specific mesa. Like the Southwest paintings of Georgia O'Keeffe and others, this painting represents a modern American reference for land as presence devoid of narrative. And just to see the variety of what we have on Southwest paintings, again, we bring in Georgia O'Keeffe and Marsden Hartley, who both present their interpretations of the Southwest. And of course, we see everything from pure abstraction to some playful movement to actual representation of Georgia O'Keeffe's front yard, as it were. Jumping ahead into the 1970s, we have this wonderful work, View Toward Little Spruce Head, by Fairfield Porter. Fairfield Porter was a prominent American painter and art critic, best known for his representational realist work created during the mid-20th century. He painted intimate landscapes, portraits, and domestic interior scenes that reflect everyday life with a vibrant, painterly style informed by both realism and modernist ideas. He was born in Illinois in 1907. He lived in the Northeast and passed away in Southampton, New York in 1975. And he studied at the Harvard University and continued his studies at the Art Student League in New York City. Throughout his career, Porter remained committed to representational painting, even during the peak of abstract expressionism in the 1950s and 1960s. His subjects often included family members and friends, and scenes of his homes in Southampton, Long Island, and Great Spruce Head Island in Maine, as well as other streetscapes, interiors, and other landscapes. His work combines observational precision with a use of color that is very rich in making his compositions. And these really show an influence of French painters, Impressionist painters, such as Pierre Bonnard and Edouard Vuillard. They're both filtered through, in his case, they're filtered through an American sensibility that is very distinct. He's using that gestural technique that we see the abstract expressionists using free hands of motion, but picking up on that very loose impressionist painterly style than something that is very hard, clear. You know, it reminds me of, you know, light reflecting on the water as he saw it and interpreted it. As I mentioned, Porter was not just a painter, but he was also a respected art critic and an essayist. He wrote for publications such as Art News and The Nation, where he articulated thoughtful positions on contemporary art and argued for the continued relevance of figurative and realist traditions alongside abstraction. His paintings are held in major museum collections, and he cemented his legacy by donating 250 works to the Parish Art Museum. He is celebrated for bridging realism and modernist expression, showing that representational art could be both observational and formally rich. His work offers a unique window into mid-20th century American life rooted in personal experience. As the object for this label reads, quote, "The creamy richness of the scene is a signature of Porter's work, where pale colored paint often eats into the territory of other colors and defies crisp outline. With just a few simple brushstrokes, the artist has dashed in the island of Little Spruce Head off the coast of Maine, where he and his family had a summer home," end quote. Next, we have Lee Hall's Spring Instance number 2. And here we see she's at a point in her career where she is experimenting with abstraction, and instead of depicting nature, we see that she's evoking nature through the use of gesture and color. Lee Hall was an American painter, writer, and educator, best known for her intellectually rigorous approach to abstraction and her deeper engagement with landscape, perception, and time. She studied at Bennington College and later earned an MFA from Yale University, where she was influenced by Joseph Albert's color theory and the post-war shift toward abstraction that still retained ties to the natural world. Hall spent much of her life teaching, most notably at the University of Delaware, and she was also a prolific art writer. That dual role, art and theorist, matters a lot for understanding Spring Instance 2. Her paintings are never casual gestures. They are carefully considered meditations on how we experience nature, memory, and change. So what does it mean? Well, we know spring signals renewal, growth, seasonal change, And here, it's not in a literal or descriptive way. Instance implies a moment, a particular occurrence, rather than a universal symbol. And we see that it's the second, so we know it's part of a series. This reinforces the idea that nature and perception is never fixed. Each instance is related, but never identical. So Hall's painting isn't spring as a postcard scene. Instead, she's painting the experience of spring as a fleeting condition with light shifting, color emerging, and space opening up. By 1979, Lee Hall was a mature artist with a fully developed visual language. American abstraction at the time had moved past the heroic gestures of abstract expressionism and into something quieter and more reflective. This is a post-color field painting and shows a renewed interest in nature without representation. It is a turn toward phenomenology, which is defined as how things are experienced rather than depicted. She often built surfaces through layering, allowing earlier colors to remain visible beneath later ones, much like the way spring emerges gradually rather than all at once. Influenced by Albers, Hall used color relationally. Colors vibrate against one another. No single hue dominates the painting. The eye is encouraged to move slowly across the surface, and this creates a contemplative rhythm closer to walking through a landscape than looking at a picture of one. Spring instance is not just about phenomenology, but also temporality. Spring is not eternal. Again, it's brief, a transitional state. So by calling this painting an instance, Hall emphasizes that what we are seeing is already passing, much in the way that we saw this passing time in early autumn by Eaton, shown earlier in the slideshow. Spring Instance belongs to a larger body of work in which Hall explores seasonal cycles. It is a late 20th century alternative to both pure abstraction and representational landscape. It can be interpreted as a bridge between painting, philosophy, and environmental awareness. Stephen Chelsea is an American painter best known for his atmospheric landscapes and nocturnes. These often depict forests, fires, storms, and transitional moments like dusk or dawn. His work reminds us of the 19th century American landscape tradition of the Hudson River School while showcasing his expressive realism. Chelsea is not interested in topographical accuracy so much as how landscape feels, how light, weather, and natural forces register emotionally. By the 1990s, his work had become darker, more compressed, and more dramatic, with fire and twilight recurring as key motifs. Twilight, Fire, and Pines shows us how Chelsea was exploring nature as a site of tension rather than pastoral calm. Nature is depicted as active, volatile, and emotionally resonant. The painting depicts a stand of pine trees at twilight with fire glowing and in the forest and beyond the forest. This is not a literal forest fire narrative painting, but instead the fire functioned as a visual and emotional force pressing against the stillness of the trees and the fading light of dusk. So, much like the work we just saw by Hall, this work is psychological, it's temporal, and it's symbolic. It shows a moment when visibility falters, if we are standing there in that instance, and emotions intensify. In Chelsea's hands, twilight is rarely peaceful. It's a moment when control slips and nature asserts itself. And so we think about, with his work, this notion of, it brings to mind, the fires in Los Angeles, right? It brings up some emotional, visceral response to destruction, regeneration, human vulnerability, uncontrollable natural energy. So kind of that idea that as we were founding this country and looking at the ominous landscapes and how challenging it can be, here we are again, more than a century later, thinking about some of these similar things that, most of us didn't work yesterday, right? Because we were worried about the ice. Nature has this assertion over the human condition sometimes. Now I'd like you to think a little bit more broadly about how we're going to define landscape in these last few slides. This is an example of a large-scale sculpture, which I understand will be on Wilson's tour later. It is Donna Dennis's tourist cabin, Pensacola, where she treats the built environment as a landscape. This is America as movement, as travel, and temporary habitation. In the 1970s, Dennis was among the first artists to push architecture into the realm of sculpture. Her work references industrial and vernacular forms in a manner that invites reflection on environment and experience. She has said, quote, "My first tourist cabin sculptures were inspired not only by childhood experiences on family trips, but also by the way a small building can stand in for a human presence." Think about that, human presence. When I came across a painting of a tourist cabin in Pensacola, Florida by Marion Post Walcott, I decided to draw it for this first piece that represented a whole building. I wanted the interior visible, but fleetingly so. I placed a single light inside the cabin and a single light on the porch in such a way that the screen door acted like a scrim, allowing only glimpses of the inside of the cabin as the viewer moves in front of the work, end quote. My interpretation of this work and of her quote, I will submit to you, is that even a single piece of architecture constructed as a sculpture can invoke an entire landscape. Perhaps not literally, but for Dennis, her cabin construction represents a spatial memory and an episodic memory. It is not an exact likeness of the cabin she stayed in, right? It's not the original preserved or an exact replica. But the way that she filters the light as one looks in it and the way that she allows viewers not to enter into it reinforces the idea that memories can be fleeting, just as buildings can be, right? So we can't fully engage and enter it. We can only see parts of it, just as our memories can be fleeting. For those buildings that endure, they bear witness to the people who lived and worked in them. So we see here 3 different examples of the work as it's installed. And as you can see, we can only get so close, right? We can't replicate her family's experience by entering into this space. But we can think about our own beach vacations or our own, now that Airbnb is so popular, those experiences, those memories that we've made when we temporarily inhabit a different space in a different environment, in a different locale than we are used to. And this brings me to the work by Beverly Buchanan. Beverly Buchanan, and neither one of these are obviously the one that are on view, but just to make the point that she is repeatedly coming back to this notion of representing houses and making different types of houses, whether they are made out of concrete, wood, and drawings, and we'll explore why. Beverly Buchanan's houses are one of the most powerful works in the late 20th century American art. They are small in scale, but huge in meaning. They're small sculptural forms. They're usually very rough, squat, and handmade. They resemble shacks, cabins, or ruined southern dwellings. And she's made them primarily from the 1970s through the 1990s. So these are not literal models of specific buildings, but instead, like the work of Dennis, they are memory structures. They look weathered, cracked, and incomplete. Whoops, sorry about that. Sometimes they are leaning or collapsing, and many times they appear abandoned and barely holding together. So what she's playing on is this idea of physical fragility, and this is intentional in her work. These houses for Buchanan are deeply rooted and connected to African American history in the rural South, the legacy of slavery, sharecropping, and segregation, and how they have often been overlooked in architecture. As in her interpretation, Black communities' architecture has often been overlooked because they were houses or spaces that were rarely documented, preserved, or even valued. Buchanan once said that these structures were, quote, places that once were, end quote, spaces erased by time, racism, and economic neglect. These works are not meant to be viewed as sentimental. They are not nostalgia. They don't romanticize the past, as we've seen with the Hudson River School, but instead, in her mind, they communicate loss, survival, resilience, and absence. She sees these as being stand-ins for those things that have been lost. And she intentionally makes them very small, whereas we just saw the dentist piece is full size, right? These are very small because she wants you to be forced to look closely, to be present in the moment, to create that personal encounter, and to think about something that was monumental in our American history as something that is intimate and human. So we don't look up at them, right, like we do at a very large Bierstadt painting. Instead, we look into them. We have to do some close inspection. Buchanan is often associated with land art, but she subverts it. When I think of land art, of course, I think of spiral jetty and very, large impositions, if you will, on the land. But she subverts it because instead of being male-dominated, monumental, and Western landscapes, again, she makes this as very modest, Southern, Black, personal, and fragmentary. And there's a precedent that I just wanted to compare as we're nearing the end, and that is, of course, her work and this documentation is not new. It's a different interpretation, but we see here Walker Evans' Frame House Charleston from 1936 and William Christenberry's Near Stewart, Alabama from 1960. So the house and structures have historically been created as landscapes, as places of memory and documentation throughout American art. Of course, Walker Evans wrote Let Us Now Praise Famous Men in the 1940s. He was an artist of the Works Progress Administration who did a lot of work with the Farm Security Administration, documenting families in the Dust Bowl and other places. And William Christenberry found the work of Walker Evans and made it his mission to photograph different structures throughout the Fayette, Alabama area where he grew up, and then went on to teach at the Corcoran School of Art. So whether Buchanan is directly influenced by this work, I can't necessarily say and don't know, but there is this precedent of how we think about and look at vernacular structures in the United States. But hers, of course, is a very personal perspective. And finally, our last work for today is by Mario Joyce, He Hears Echoes from 2024. And of course, I know that there's been a series on contemporary art, but I could not let us go without discussing this very contemporary work because it very much is a personal landscape. He Hears Echoes is a large-scale triptych painting, meaning it's three different panels attached together, and it was created by contemporary American artist Mario Joyce. Each panel measures about 72 inches by 60 inches, 72 inches by 60 inches, and combines soil, vintage collage materials, oil paint, acrylic paint, and pastel on canvas, what we used to call mixed media. Joyce is a self-taught African-American artist based in Los Angeles whose practice centers on genealogical research, memory, and lived experience, especially within African-American and queer contexts. His source materials like soil from his family's farm and vintage collage imagery embed ancestral narratives directly into his textured paintings. In He Hears Echoes, Joyce constructs a compelling narrative through both material and imagery. The triptych features a central floating figure representing a self-portrait set against a stark contrast of blackened earth and a bright yellow sky. This figure is composed of collage materials, again, including these vintage images, along with other images of psychedelic references to the 1960s and 70s. And they're meant to represent inner turmoil, social upheaval, and lingering historical resonance. The soil that he has collected and he incorporates comes from his family's farm in rural Ohio, and again symbolizes that idea of ancestral land and also physical lineage. So for Joyce, the soil is not just material, but it carries the presence of his family's history and stories with him, and he wants to communicate that to his audience through its inclusion. The work tackles the transformative power of family stories, especially in African American communities that have historically relied on oral history as a means of cultural survival. By embedding images and materials tied to personal and collective memory, Joyce creates a visual metaphor for unearthing buried stories and the echoes that live in both body and psyche. So much in the way that Buchanan is exploring memory and exploring ancestry, whether or not maybe directly hers, Joyce is very much drawing on his personal experience and trying to capture that and hold on to it, right? In the way that we do with genealogies, but here in a very visual and visceral work of art. So his family narratives shape his personal and his collective identity. They talk about, in his works communicate his relationship between his past traumas and his present consciousness. And they communicate intangible experiences, such as histories and emotions that he embodies visually. The title itself suggests that the work is about finding and listening to echoes of the past, reverberations of ancestral voices, cultural memories, and historical experience that continue to resonate with populations today and moving forward. And so his process is deeply intentional. So, I ask you, what have we learned from this journey today? We have learned, I hope, some of the takeaways are that landscape in American art does not fade away, it evolves. It begins as a sacred wilderness, it becomes home, then city, then memory, and finally abstraction and conceptual idea. Ultimately, these works show us that when American artists paint the land, they are really painting how it feels to live here in a particular moment in history. So I want to thank you for taking this journey with me. Thank you for your time and attention, and I look forward to seeing you and hope that you will come back next week for our discussion of American still life paintings. Thank you.